So good morning and welcome again to our study of Daniel. Today lesson 8 and chapter 4, the entire chapter. Now as we go through this, it's important to keep in mind again that the whole theory of this book is about man's obedience and God's sovereignty. And it's sort of interesting to go back to the book of Ecclesiastes and look at the last verse in chapter 12 of that book, where Solomon, after all his adventures, all his exploits, all his abilities, he ended up with this one conclusion. The conclusion of this whole matter, he says, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. And this is really what happened to Nebuchadnezzar in this book of Daniel. As we start chapter 4, it's important to understand that we're probably 30 years after the conquest by Nebuchadnezzar of Jerusalem. And therefore Daniel has been in the service of this king for at least that many years. And he's still loyal to the king. And Nebuchadnezzar starts off this chapter, which he apparently has written himself, about his exploits and about what has happened to him. And he starts this off with these words, Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. He's giving this to everybody, and he really controlled most of the known world at that time. Peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to declare the signs and wonders that the Most High God has worked for me. How great are his signs, and how mighty his wonders. The kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. Nebuchadnezzar starts off this chapter, this part of the book, which he apparently wrote himself, with really a summary of what how he has come to feel after the events that have occurred to him and are documented in the rest of the chapter which follows. So this was a summary verse of the entire chapter in a sense. Now, Nebuchadnezzar has praised God before. When Daniel interpreted his first dream, he talked about how mighty and how correct was the God of Israel and Daniel's God. But then he seemed to have forgotten that when he built this huge statue in the plain of Duma and wanted everybody in the land to bow down to it, including Daniel's 3 friends. And when they didn't, he threw them into the furnace. And when they were seen walking around unbound in the flames, he then praised God again, the God of Daniel and the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He praised them as being the God, the only true God. Now here he is, years later, praising God again, after another event which took place. And he again has forgotten a lot of what he apparently learned from those other 2 lessons because of what happened to him in this book, in this chapter of this book. So he starts off with a summary statement. After everything that takes place in chapter 4, he comes up with this statement, which he puts at the first of the chapter, praising God for his wonders, for his signs, and for his mighty works, for his kingdom. He was recognizing that God's kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and where he himself thought his own kingdom would be such. So he goes on to say how he came to feel this way, because he had a second dream. He had a second dream which is described in the first number of chapters following first number of verses following in chapter 4, when he talks about this huge tree which he saw growing in the plain, a tree so great that it actually touched the heavens, that it was had all the leaves, had all the birds nesting in it, had shade for the animals, it had this great mighty edifice. He said height was great. A tree was in the midst of the earth. It grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens. It could be seen to the ends of all the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and so in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade. The birds of the heavens dwelt in it, and all flesh was fed from it. He saw this huge, magnificent tree growing. And this was his dream, and he had called all his soothsayers, the same ones that had failed to interpret the initial dream about the great Colossus. He called them all back again, and when they failed once more to give him the correct interpretation, he called upon Daniel, and Daniel again came in, and when he heard the dream, it says Daniel hesitated. Hesitated because when the dream went on, he said he saw an angel coming down from heaven, cut down this tree, down to the stump, bound the stump with iron and bronze, and then he considered the stump became a being, and it was dwelt in the dew of the grass, fed on the grass of the earth, and the heart was changed from that of a man to that of a beast. So Daniel had this second dream about this huge, magnificent structure, this tree, which is then cut down. The stump was bound with iron and brass, and then the stump became a being, a living person, who then lived in the dew of the grass, was fed by the grass, and became like an animal. And this said, this decision is by the decree of the watchers and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. This was the dream. And it's all listed in chapter 4. And all his soothsayers, the Chaldeans, the magicians, the astrologers that he had called before at the first dream, was unable to interpret this, or unwilling to interpret it. And Daniel was called, and it said he was astonished for a time. He was not forthcoming with interpretation as he might have been expected to be. He hesitated. And he said, I wish that this was about your enemies and not about you, King Nebuchadnezzar, because Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar had become quite close in friendship over those intervening years, where Daniel had been his advisor. He had been trusted by Nebuchadnezzar. He had been taken into the inner circle. He was one of his trusted advisors. He had become friends. Even though Nebuchadnezzar was a conqueror and Daniel was really a slave, they had become close. And Daniel said, I wish, my friend, that this was not about you, but it is. And he interpreted the dream, whereas the tree he felt was Nebuchadnezzar himself in all his glory and all his power and all his strength and in all his majesty and all his authority. It was exemplified by this huge tree that grew on the plain of Duma in his dream. And then, when it was cut down, it showed that Nebuchadnezzar would be cut down to size, and how he himself would become as an animal for 7 years because of what he had become himself in real life, a proud, authoritarian person. Now it also said that because of this, there might have been a time, he said, there shall drive you from men, your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. This is the interpretation that he had given to Nebuchadnezzar for 7 years, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. But his kingdom would be preserved because the stump was held intact and guarded. Now, this was God's warning to King Nebuchadnezzar. And it took 12 months before anything happened. It was 12 months that came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of the 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. And he was apparently about or on the roof of the palace, looking over the huge city of Babylon, over which he was king. And this was truly a magnificent city. According to history, this was probably the most famous city in the world, in the ancient world. Its walls were about 387 feet high and were 80 feet thick. You could drive 4 chariots side by side on top of these walls. They were 15 miles on each side. And I can't imagine a wall that high, that thick, stretching for 15 miles on 4 sides. That just mind-boggling. But this was apparently what the city of Babylon was surrounded by. And in the city itself, the river Euphrates was in there. It watered the gardens, it watered the plants. It grew enough food for all of the 1.2 million inhabitants of the city. And on top of all this, the king had for one of his queens fashioned what are known as the 7th wonder of the world, the hanging gardens of Babylon. These were gardens which were on terraces, but arranged in such a way that they apparently floated in the air. And they were one of the wonders of the world. They were watered by pumped water of the Euphrates River. And he did this for one of his queens, who missed the greenery and the lushness of her home country. And this was the scene that King Nebuchadnezzar was looking out over from the roof of his palace when he said these famous words, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty?" He was taking all the credit, and in his pride assumed that everything had been done by his hand. And this is the story, as the theme of the story of this chapter, is the pride of Nebuchadnezzar. It says in Proverbs 6, there are 6 things that the Lord hates, in Proverbs 6, starting in verse 16. 6 things which the Lord hates. A proud look, number 1. A lying tongue. Hands that shed innocent blood. A heart that devises wicked plans. Feet that are swift in running to evil. A false witness who speaks lies. And one who sows discord among brethren. The first thing mentioned in that is a proud look. And pride is one of the main themes. It's considered probably the main sin of all the sins possible in the Bible. And Proverbs mentions it a number of times. Proverbs 8:13 says, "Pride and arrogance and the evil way and the perverse mouth I hate." Proverbs 11:2, "When pride comes, then comes shame, but with the humble is wisdom." Proverbs 16:5, "Everyone proud in heart is an abomination to the Lord. Although they join forces, none will go unpunished." Proverbs 16:18, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall." Proverbs 21:4, "A haughty look, a proud heart, and the plowing of the wicked are sin." A man's pride will bring him low, but the humble in spirit will retain honor. And in James 4:6 it says, "God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." So this whole thing, Nebuchadnezzar, although he had seen previous examples of God's grace and God's power and God's authority, he again resisted and became so proud in his own being, in what he felt he had done by himself without any help from God, without any input from anyone else, what he had accomplished in his own power and might. Because he had become so proud in this, God gave him a warning in the dream about the tree and it being cut down and what would happen to the stump after it was left. And Nebuchadnezzar did not follow this warning. Many times God's judgment comes upon nations, comes upon us, but a warning always comes first. If you go back to the times when Jeroboam was ruler over the 10 tribes in northern Israel, and Rehoboam was ruler over the tribes in Judah. On both occasions there were warnings given before the Assyrians invaded and conquered Israel, and before the Babylonians invaded and conquered Judah. In the book of Judges, on all the times that Israel fell away from God, there were warnings given before they lost out to inhabitants and invading armies. And then when they turned back to God, they succeeded in defeating their enemies. And this is really what God is doing here. He gave Nebuchadnezzar a warning that something would happen if he did not change his ways. And Daniel had said this to him. If he changed his ways and had become more understanding, less prideful, then things might not have come to bear upon him. So he said in the end, in verse 27, "Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity." He indicated that God would have lenience and the judgment would not fall if he had done these things. Now back in the book of Jonah, Jonah was sent to Nineveh because of the fact that this was such an evil city. And as a result of that, God had said, go to Nineveh and preach and warn them that judgment is coming. And even though Jonah was reluctant to do that, and we know the story of Jonah, but he did go and he did preach. And it says in the end of chapter 3 in the book of Jonah, "And then God saw their works, that they turned from their evil way, and God relented from the disaster that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it." We, in today's world, are being warned by many of the disasters, many of the apparent things that are happening. But perhaps God is warning us again about impending judgment if we don't go back to the way we should be. And we are so far away from God right now that I think we are inviting disaster upon ourselves. The warning may be there, the warnings are there. We need to listen to them. And this is an example from the book of Daniel, what happens when we don't listen to the warnings. So Nebuchadnezzar had the event befall him. And as a result, he became like a animal for a number of years. What he became was, there is a medical term for that, although it's a very rare condition. It's called lycopathy, which really means wolf and man, where people become like an animal, not in their, they feel they want to be like an animal, but they actually become animal-like. It's a very rare, but it is a condition that has been documented. And this may be what happened to him. So he became like this wild animal for a period of 7 years. Daniel apparently still looked over him, looked out for him, looked after the kingdom while he was absent from his throne. And at the end of 7 years, he said, at the end of the time, I lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. Why do we have to go to the furthest depths of despair and degradation before we understand the need to recognize and honor God? But it happens. It happens all the time. And this is what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He had everything in the world a person could possibly want except a relationship with God. And God took him down to the lowest he could take him for 7 years before he came back and recognized and blessed the Most High and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, no one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? This is God's own authority to do as he wills, as he wishes, to whom he wills, to whom he wishes, when he wills, and when he wishes. And it says in the last part of chapter 4, at the same time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles reported to me, and I was restored to my kingdom. And excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, and his ways justice. And those who walk in pride, he is able to put down. Nebuchadnezzar was the prime example of this. And so this ends Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It ends the interpretation of his dream and the results of his dream. And in fact, it ends the presence of Nebuchadnezzar in this book. This is the last we'll hear of him in this book. But Daniel was still there, honoring and working beside him and working with him, waiting for the time when he could again bring Nebuchadnezzar to the insight of how important and how true God really is. Is there any evidence that he actually became a convert to the Jewish God? We don't really know. Although this indicates that it is most likely he certainly was on that track. There's very little actually known more than this about Nebuchadnezzar. So we don't know the whole story or the whole ending. But in these words, Nebuchadnezzar appears to have accepted the reality, the truth, and the authority of Christ, or of God, And as a result of that, he was restored to his kingdom. His successors, however, did not follow suit, as we will see in subsequent chapters. So Nebuchadnezzar was humbled and repented, and he praised God for what he had done and what he could do. This is something we all have to keep in mind. At some time, our deeds will come to haunt us if we don't acknowledge God, if we don't accept God, if we don't accept his authority. As Solomon said, it is man's all to honor God and keep his commandments. So that is the end of chapter 4. It's the end of Nebuchadnezzar. I hope you'll join me next week as we start in with chapter 5 and in a new series of Kings of Babylon. And I look forward to seeing you then. Bye for now.